Hey everybody, we are back and welcome to another edition of Cross Atlantic Crosstalk. With us as always is the show's own Julia Doubleday, Deputy Director of Committee, and again Ellie Mae O'Hagan, the Director of Class, a think tank in the UK. And we're going to talk about some of the issues that came up this week on what was a very quiet week on the non-stormy Atlantic. And then invite a special guest in, Vishnu Sam from New Delhi Television, to talk a bit more about India, which we touched on last time. So look, there are some elections that are happening in the UK right now. Results are trickling in. I know for Scotland and for Wales, they aren't all in yet, etc. But for England, the results seem to be pretty clear. Can you walk us through what is happening on your happy island?
Well, it's been a catastrophic 24 hours for the Labour Party. Basically, I think that's the main thing. We had a by-election in Hartlepool, which I guess is it's described as a red wall seat. So I suppose I think I said this last week. If I was going to translate it to an American context, it might be somewhere like Wisconsin or maybe like smaller, but you know that kind of seat. And it has been Labour for 57 years. It was held twice when Jeremy Corbyn was leader, and it's sort of seen as Keir Starmer's first major test as leader of the Labour Party, and they lost it quite significantly. To a candidate who lives 30 miles away from the constituency, who has lived in the Cayman Islands, which is kind of famous for being a tax haven. So it's not even as though they've lost it to a really great local candidate as well. So at the moment, really, what you're seeing is just a lot of recriminations about that. And Labour also looks at the early declarations from the council elections, so that's like the kind of local government elections. Labour is also doing quite badly there so far, and there's been a few mayoral elections where it looks like Labour is going to have a tough time if it doesn't lose all of them. Sadiq Khan in London is probably going to be okay. And Joanne Anderson, who is the Labour mayoral candidate for Liverpool, is also probably going to be okay. But that one had to go into a runoff. And for Liverpool to go into a runoff is kind of like Portland going into a runoff with Republicans.
Right,
You know,
right.
it's
The
like
fact that it's
I
being
don't know if that's a
contested is
good
what's shocking.
comparison. Yeah, exactly. The fact that it had to go into a runoff is worrying. So basically, the headline takeaway is it's very bad for
I
Labour.
mean, the at the Red Wall in the north, they already lost so many votes with Labour leavers or with other folks unhappy with the party for whatever reason. Who are the folks that they're losing now, and where are they going?
They aren't going anywhere. They're sitting on their sofas. They are not voting. Once again, the best performing candidate in this election was nobody. The Nobody Party. They outperformed all of the other political parties. And I mean, it's too early really to sort of make like do a lot of sort of really detailed analysis. But I think from Hartlepool, it seems like the swing to the Tories was like, a couple of maybe like 1,000, 2,000 votes. The real problem was Labour voters not turning out. And I think really that is completely understandable because I cannot answer the question of why you should vote Labour right now. I'm a lifelong, Labour voter. I've been a Labour member for many, many years, nearly 10 years. And this was the least enthusiastic I've felt in my whole life about voting Labour. And I include Blair in that, it was I did it out of kind of resentful habit, basically. And so if you're someone who isn't really politically engaged and, you're tired and like you've got to go to work, why would you take time out of your day to go and stand in a queue to vote if you don't have a reason to, and that's really, I think, to me is the biggest sort of takeaway. So from what I can see so far is that the Labour vote just didn't turn out.
I actually want to know one more thing, but Julia, don't let me like totally monopolize Ellie's time. Is there anything that you want to know coming out of this election and seeing these results? I do know that Keir Starmer says he's taking responsibility going into them for the results, but Julia, please.
Well, I mean, I think this gets at what you were talking about last week, which is that whereas Biden in the US has acknowledged at this point, or the people around him understand that even though they were able, by all sort of teaming up to defeat the Bernie Sanders movement in the presidential primary, that they still have to incorporate some aspects of progressivism into their administration just because it was such a ultimately it was a narrow victory in the sense that they had to force a bunch of people to drop out, and it was a very large operation to sort of get him out of the running. So they understand that the left is sort of at their heels. We also additionally have all of these Justice Democrats coming into Congress. It seems like what's happened in the UK is, like as you were saying last week, just a completely opposite, like we just don't want you in the party at all, kind of like trying to just cleanse the party of any progressives. And I think at this point there's just not there's not room for just a centrist party to win, because ultimately centrist parties represent continuation of the status quo, and we're all just at this point. I mean, in 2021, after last year, after these just back to back to back to back climate disasters, people may not know the word neoliberalism, and they may not know about trade deals, they may not know about a lot of things, but they certainly know that the status quo isn't working. They know it's not working for them. They know that they're making less money than their parents were at their age, and that they can't afford homes. So I think this result, really unsurprising, because as you were saying, Ellie, it's just, what are they offering at this point?
Yeah, and I think I guess like for an American audience, what's happened in the UK is if you imagine that Bernie Sanders had won the nomination and became the Democratic candidate, and then became and then basically was absolutely sort of the one election he came much closer than people were expecting, but then at the next one that he was absolutely like defeated completely comprehensively. So you can imagine how the Democrats would react to that. And then if you imagine that off the back of that, you got someone like Joe Biden, or even maybe Starmer is more of a Buttigieg. And I mean, he's not really into tech, but you know what I mean? That's more of his, that's closer to his vibe than Biden. And then suddenly, like he employed sort of all of Hillary Clinton's most aggressive advisors. Imagine how the American left would be now being treated if that had happened. And that's what's happening to the British left. So I think like we're in a situation at the moment where the centre has all of the institutional power, but none of the ideas, because this era, like exactly as you say, demands radicalism. It sort of demands left-wing answers. It just kind of does. And so, but they can't do that because that's beyond the pale for them. So they have no ideas, but they have lots of institutional power. And I think what you've got in the US is like the Democrats, the sort of moderate, centrist, whatever Democrats, wielding their institutional power, but allowing the left to sort of, come to them with ideas and sort of taking those ideas on. Whereas what we've got in Britain is like the left took the party away from us and they lost an election, and our priority now must never be like never allowing that to happen again, even if it means like destroying ourselves. That apparently seems to be what's going on, because you said, Arun, that like the statement is from Starmer, like I take
Yeah,
responsibility
he's
for the
carrying the
result.
bucket.
But what is like actually happening is that him and the people around him are saying, well, we always knew it was going to take a long time to recover from the 2019 election result. So
Yeah,
this is
Long
part of us
Corbyn,
like
as it's
building back.
offensively being called on Twitter. I saw. Yeah, I don't like that.
Yeah, and also like so but in order to sort of, if it was a recovery of the 2019 result, then Labour would have done badly but better, but they've actually done worse. So it's sort of going in, it's not, it can't be termed as a recovery, I think, by any metric, because it's getting worse. Go
Yeah,
on,
no,
sorry,
so
Arun,
but in
you say something.
Hartpool, is the worsening due to some extent to new players? Like, I think some of us observed the Northern Independence Party emerge online to then all of a sudden field a real candidate. Were there labor protest votes going to the Northern Independence Party?
I think they got about 6% of the vote, which would have still, if that had all gone to Labour, that would have still been, and I think the Greens got about 1 or 2%. So then you're looking at 8 points. But I mean, and Labour still would have lost, but 8 points isn't nothing.
Does it
I'd
show
take 8 points
appetite
more.
for actually, yeah, I guess how existentially wounded is the potential for labor due to other people attracting their levers?
I think so we've got, I don't know how like common this phrase was in the US, but if there's Europeans watching it, they'll know it. The Passocification is the phrase that we use to describe the decline of Europe's social democratic parties, and it takes its name from the Greek social democratic main party called PASOK. What we're seeing is a lot of Labour's sister parties in Europe. They're on like horrible figures. They're on like, some of them are on like 4%. These are like parties that would get like 30,
Yeah, but
40%
I
10
think
years
Dutch
ago.
Labour Party, the PvdA, is a very good example of somebody who just had that kind of election.
Yeah, exactly. And I think in this country, because we have a first past the post electoral system, there is like a floor for Labour, which I would say is about 25% maybe. At its very worst, because it's very hard for new parties to break through. And I think that's maybe why you're not seeing as many protest votes as you might otherwise. Because, people like me who like detest the Tory party I will always vote Labour out of sheer fear that like not doing that will get a Tory, means we'll get a Tory. And I think there'll always be like just enough of those people to mean that like there will always be like a decent floor for Labour. So, but I think, I sort of said this today a couple of times on social media. I think we are seeing like Passocification. I hate saying that word. Passocification of Labour, insofar as it can happen in our electoral system. And I actually think if we had an electoral system like some of those European parties, like in the Netherlands, as you just mentioned, then I think Labour would be in serious trouble.
From some gloomy news to some better news, the cross-Atlantic crosstalk bump happened, and us just challenging the United States to think about IP differently has resulted in Joe Biden coming forth. I have absolutely no doubt that it was 100% because of us coming out in favor of dropping IP. Can you tell us a bit about this, Julia, and why it's exciting? And then also, once you do that, temper our excitement, because that's how it works around here.
Right. Well, so as we were discussing last week, some of the poorer countries in the World Trade Organization brought this proposal for a waiver to patent rights to the WTO. I think it was India and South Africa. And essentially, the votes on that waiver of patent protections for the intellectual property of the vaccine. So, in other words, the recipe to make the vaccines. Right now, it's secret and it's held by pharmaceutical companies. That vote split pretty much just along first world, third world sort of lines. So, the US and Europe and Australia, Japan, all of the richer countries, Canada, that already have enough vaccines for their population, they voted no, do not suspend the IP rights. That will, create bad incentives, and then pharma will want to come in and make more vaccines for us in the future. Every excuse in the book. And then all the poorer countries obviously voted that they wanted to pass the waiver. This week, I was quite surprised, elatedly surprised, as I think a lot of us were, to see that Biden's administration has decided that they're going to support the waiver. this is a really big announcement. It means that there's actually a really good chance that it could happen just because of the global influence the US has. I will say, as I
I mean, we're
was
about to
mentioning,
find out how much global influence Joe Biden has when it comes to something. But sorry,
right.
go
So
ahead.
the other issue is that there are still quite a lot of countries opposing the waiver. So it's not just the US that needs to get on board with this. It's also, we saw this morning that Germany, Angela Merkel was like, no, this is a bad idea. I don't know if any of the other rich countries have yet reversed their position, but we'll see what happens at the WTO. Is certainly a really promising, and it's a great first step. Even beyond that, though, obviously there's going to have to be more investment of resources. This is sort of like the bare minimum of what we can do is just give them the instructions to build the vaccine. We also need to likely help with infrastructure and resources in order to really get this thing off the ground. And of course, I just want to reiterate that like this is something that is crucial for global public health. Every global public health expert is in favor of it. Without it, we're going to continue to see these more and more mutated forms of the virus that are continuing to spread all over the world. I think I saw this week that they found some of the Indian variants in the UK. So it's just really important that we treat this like we all live on the same planet because we do.
I mean, but speaking of India, it's one of the places, and we have a guest coming on right now, but where actually just the recipe is all that's needed from the IP. Like there are already so many, very high production facilities that are geared towards putting out vaccines that are similar towards this. So bringing on our special guest from NGTV, Vishnu Som. Hi, thank you for joining us. And he is in India right now.
Hi there, Arun.
Yeah, thank you for coming on. Can you tell us a bit? I mean, we're just talking about the good news with this, but obviously, the situation on the ground right now is extremely concerning. Can you tell us a bit about what's happening? And then we're going to start pushing you on the politics behind it, because that's something we don't get as much news about.
Well, Arun, I was just listening in on what you're saying, and before I come to your question, the entire patent issue is absolutely critical for India, a country which requires as many vaccinations as possible. But I was speaking to Kiran Mazumdar-Shaw yesterday on my program, and she's the chairperson of Biocon. It's one of the largest Indian pharma companies. And the point that she makes, and I mean, in speaking to some of the other big Indian pharma companies, including the Serum Institute of India, what they have indicated to me is that, look, it's going to take at least 9 to 11 months after negotiations at the WTO are complete for generics to actually happen. And it's not so much a policy issue, it is about actually procuring raw materials and then transferring that knowledge and the infrastructure to companies which actually have the ability to manufacture and then to ensure quality. So we are fighting around the world against COVID, and it's a battle against time. And therefore, while this is a great initiative, and obviously everybody realizes the threat we presently face, it's not likely to happen in a very finite period of time. But briefly to come to your situation on the ground in India, it is without any doubt the biggest threat that we have faced since our partition. The fact is that India is now averaging approximately 400,000 cases every single day, 4,000 deaths every single day, give or take a few hundred cases for the last several days. Um, and this makes India, very much the world's hotspot. The health infrastructure in several parts of the country has entirely collapsed. Oxygen availability has entirely collapsed. Hospital bed availability has entirely collapsed. And I am sitting in Delhi right now talking to you in a city which has the finest, the best health infrastructure in India. And it's gone over here. It doesn't exist. If you want a bed, you aren't going to get it. If you want oxygen, good luck. And the big worry now is that it's going to Karnataka next, where the numbers, India's IT capital is Bengaluru. The numbers are staggering over there. And there's a real fear that it could go to Kolkata as well, in addition to some of the other southern cities. So that's the big worry, that this is now traveling all over the country. And the health infrastructure which exists is simply not capable of taking the load of patients.
I want to hand it over to Ellie to ask a question, but first, Is there political problem, as we've seen the mismanagement from so many governments that sort of bear a similar shape to Narendra Modi's government? Is there a political problem in tackling this, or is it simply a resource issue, and once we get the resources high enough, everything else should snap into place?
So I don't think it's a political issue. I think it's gross mismanagement at various levels. And whether that stems from this government being in power or another government being in power, one doesn't know. But the fact of the matter is that at various levels, this has been mismanaged. I think the greatest example of the mismanagement is the fact that on the 4th of March, and again, this is something which, I mean, I've done in my own program, that we've discussed this with experts, leading data modelers and epidemiologists entrusted with the task of projecting a second wave in India on the 4th of March had actually said that, look, in a finite period of time, in other words, a couple of weeks, you'd have approximately 120,000 cases. At that stage, India was well under control a few weeks prior to that. We didn't have this issue. But the government just sat there. The election commission allowed the elections to take place. The government went ahead with their leading politicians, the prime minister, the home minister, other political parties did the same, and they went and they canvassed and they polled and they polled. These were super spreader events. And the fact is, if you look at yesterday's statistics, in all of the states where there have been elections which have just ended now, there has been a very significant rise in COVID cases. So where is the accountability? There is one of the largest gatherings in humanity, the Kumbh Mela, where literally hundreds of thousands of devotees participate. But there is a mismatch between faith and science behind COVID. And in a situation like this, you have to go with science, and the science says you cannot be having this. Again, many patients, many people are likely to have contracted COVID there and traveled all across the country. So there's mismanagement at that level. There's mismanagement in terms of the vaccination policy, whether India, in fact, should have put in a lot more money into buying vaccines rather than exporting vaccines. So, one could go on, and perhaps the biggest example of mismanagement, two actually. Number one, uh, the inability of the government to understand that a lockdown is the priority. You need to save lives first. And in as much as you want to save the economy, you have to save lives first. Because if you don't save lives, you don't save the economy. And we are well beyond the stage when that decision should have been taken. So what they're looking at now are containment zones in certain areas. You need to break an all-India transmission of this, particularly with mutant strains. And secondly, oxygen availability. How did you not know, on the basis of what one has seen in the United Kingdom, that people are gasping for breath, that hospitals are being overrun? Did you have your eyes open? Did you not know that it took the United Kingdom 3 months of a lockdown and an incredible vaccination program to actually get that situation under control? India is a large country. We have lots of problems. But I think the inability to understand that this was staring us at the face has been perhaps the biggest problem. So I won't use the word political. I would use the word mismanagement.
Yeah, no, that seems fair. I do want to open it up for others to be able to ask a question. Yes,
Shall I ask
please.
one? So in the UK, we had a second wave that was not on the same scale as India's, but it was pretty bad, and it resulted in the deaths of I think it's like 130,000 people now, and it was, if you ask me, it was mainly a result of government decisions, and yet we can see from the elections that are happening today that the government is doing really, really well. So I was just curious as to your impressions of how this might affect Modi's popularity, what's happening at the moment.
Yeah.
Well, Modi has just lost an election in the state of West Bengal. I'm a Bengali. I'm from Kolkata, which is the capital of West Bengal. Um, and the juggernaut of the BJP, which appeared in many senses to be an overwhelming political force in India, has very much been stopped at the doorstep of Mamata Banerjee, who will be back as chief minister of the state of West Bengal. And uh, Bengal was one of the primary political goals of Narendra Modi and the BJP. Now, it's difficult to say whether the handling of COVID had an impact because many phases of the election and the counting had actually of the voting had actually taken place before the surge, or it was happening when the surge wasn't as big a story. But the BJP has lost that election, number one. Number two, I'm not sure whether it's going to have a long-term impact on Narendra Modi just yet, because 2024 is when we have our national elections. Still, there is still a way to get there. It's important to remember that Modi is an immensely popular leader in this country. And a popularity beyond what many could even imagine would be comprehensible. But that's a reality. Whether this handling of COVID, the fact that we are seeing record numbers of death, will have a political impact in 2024, at this juncture, it's difficult to say.
Yeah. Go ahead, Julie.
Well, I was just sort of going to piggyback on that question and maybe dig a little deeper into Indian politics, just because before you got on, Ellie and I were discussing the sort of collapse of centrism. So the idea that around the world we're seeing insurgent, right-wing, fascist leaders who become wildly popular, and then to counterbalance that, we also have seen people with a more leftist vision rising to prominence, but in a lot of cases not being able to hold on to power the way the right wing can, because they are so shut out of institutions by centrists who are really afraid of drastic changes, especially on like an economic level. So something I've read about in India is I guess my question would be about the Congress party. My impression is Congress would be parallel to sort of the US Democrats or the UK Labour Party, in that Congress is the quote unquote further left party, but they're still, subscribers to a neoliberal economic system and the sort of development policies that we've seen over the last few decades. And because of that, they're maybe not having the kind of success they used to. So could you just tell us a little bit about what is happening in the Congress party right now? Is there an evolution happening in the party? Are they becoming more or less popular?
Viable opposition, I think, is maybe the harsher way of asking the question. Yeah.
No, I think just to Julia, to take your question and to answer Arun specifically, the Congress isn't a viable option to the BJP or an alternative to the BJP at the national level. Yes, it is true that the Congress continues to be in power in a couple of states. The state of Punjab, for example, they're in a coalition in Maharashtra. There are other couple of states, Rajasthan, which is a very large state as well. Um, but the fact of the matter is they're no longer as powerful a state as they used to be in the past. And while at the assembly level, at the level of states, they still do have a presence and are in power in a couple of states, Chhattisgarh, another one, for example, they are certainly not a national level threat in the manner in which they used to dominate Indian politics anymore. Even in the recent assembly elections, which have just gotten over a couple of days back, the Congress didn't feature anywhere in the state of West Bengal, which I spoke to you earlier on. In the state of Kerala, there's always been this the left or the Congress and their allies coming back to power. On one election, it would be the left. On one election, it would be the Congress, the LDF and the UDF. The UDF being Congress, the LDF being left. But on this occasion, the LDF, the left, has come back for 2 consecutive terms. So, it's not switched around. So that's another indicator of the Congress being unable to sort of get power even in states where, they've done well in the past. They are in an alliance in the state of Tamil Nadu next to Kerala, but they aren't the dominant force there by any means. They've lost very significantly in the state of Assam. The BJP was in power, they retained power, they did hope to actually regain Assam, but they haven't been able to do that. So, that said, it's not enough to suggest that at the level of states, the BJP is overwhelmingly dominant. There are important regional political parties, which at the level of assemblies would actually have a say. But whether these coalition parties would be able to come together during a national election and defeat the BJP, that's very much up in the air. And at the moment, there aren't any indications of that happening.
Sorry, Ellie, were you trying to jump in?
No, I was just thinking, is there not an unpopulated island that all globally left-wing people can just move to? Could we look
Well, the
into
Congress
that?
doesn't believe it's left, and it's just that we are in a phase in our country where we have an immensely popular right-wing government, which appears to be able to handle a lot of the allegations and a lot of what we in the media, in the few remaining independent media in India, can actually report and show truth to power. It doesn't affect them. That's a separate
I want to
issue.
give you the last word, Vishnu, on this. Can you also tell us what the aftermath of the protests that, even the progressive left in America, were able to see because of the scale, and even despite some, I would say, very scant coverage, especially in Western press. But how that is affecting the situation now, and if you think that that is the seeds of whatever comes next as a viable opposition to the BJP.
If you're talking about the farmer protests have sort of um, ground to a halt as of day before yesterday. But the farmer protests are seeing a revival of sorts with thousands of farmers coming towards Delhi and asserting their presence on the ground, which is exactly the wrong thing to do in a COVID scenario right now. But again, as it's strange because our foreign minister just a couple of days back seemed to suggest that democracy sort of comes ahead of COVID, uh, in India, and if this is an expression of democracy, then it certainly comes at a wrong time as well. Um, so it's too broad a question, Arun, and I won't be able to sort of nail it down with any specific answer. But I think just linking to what our overall theme has broadly been, COVID, the presence of farmer protesters on the outskirts of Delhi now, after the protests had ground to a halt for several weeks, is deeply problematic because this could easily be super spreader
Triggering.
events. And I think there's one final point that I would like to very briefly mention is that in as much as India faces a second wave now, a second surge in COVID now, the government is perhaps for the first time proactively saying that, look, it's not over. They aren't hiding the fact that there is going to be a third surge. And I think the big worry is this third surge associated with the so called India double mutant? Because this variant of the coronavirus is extremely infectious, it's extremely transmissible, and it is spreading to parts of the country, and that's been now identified. Its characteristics are yet to be entirely defined. But the fact is, it does have some shared, you know, characteristics as what we've seen with the B117 variant in the United Kingdom. But until there is more gene sequencing and epidemiological tests, we will not be in a position to actually know how much the vaccines work, and we will not be able to know how patients need to be treated or the prognosis on the onset of the disease. If this actually surges in the manner in which people believe it might, then India could actually be looking at something even more dangerous than what we are looking at now. Therefore, it all boils down to common sense. So, all across the world, we need to mask up, maintain social distancing, and we need to vaccinate. India's absolute numbers in vaccination are still reasonably impressive. But as a percentage of the population that needs to be vaccinated, it's minuscule. And with vaccines now being in shortage in the pharmacy of the world, which is India, that remains deeply problematic.
Yeah, it is extremely scary. I hope we can check in with you in a few weeks and see how things are going, and continue to try to tell a story that's not. It's being told, but in a very familiar kind of patronizing global North versus South kind of way, and not as you're saying, as the world will not heal until, especially a place as big as India, gets over the hump, and so we are all in it together. Thank you so much, Vishnu,
Thank you very
Julia,
much.
Ellie, and we'll see the two of you next week, and Vishnu will talk soon.